I keep a duty log. Every post officer at Renfeld transfer does. It is a condition of the assignment, and most of what goes into it is tedious enough that I have never once read back a page from 3 months prior. Date, time, party, purpose, outcome. The log is a formality. That is what I believed until the morning Corporal Edric Hayne arrived with a casket and a set of orders that 4 different people tried to tell him were insufficient. I will tell you what I saw, because I was standing 6 feet away and I wrote it down while it was still happening. And what I wrote down is one of the few things in this log I would stand behind in any room before any authority, without preparation. Renfeld is a border transfer post on the Aldenmere frontier, one of the older crossing points, built for commerce, not ceremony. There is a low inspection shed, a vehicle lane, a flagpole for the Neutral Commission standard, and a strip of cracked paving that serves as the formal handover ground. It has handled the return of 2 bodies in my 4 years here. Neither occasion required what Hayne brought with him. Neither occasion was conducted the way Hayne conducted this one. He arrived at 7:15, which was 45 minutes ahead of the scheduled handover window. That punctuality would matter later, though I did not know it then. He came in a Keldrath 1st Regiment transport driver and the corporal, nothing else. No honor party, no second escort, no senior officer. The orders he carried were correct and countersigned at 3 levels. I checked them myself while Hayne stood at the inspection shed window and said nothing. He was in full ceremonial dress, red tunic, bearskin, white gloves, medals, rifle slung, every piece of it immaculate despite however many hours he'd spent in that transport on the frontier roads. He was perhaps 30. He had the kind of face that does not offer you much. The casket arrived from the Valdrenian side at 8, under the custody of senior attaché dressed Colvin, who was the Valdrenian liaison officer for cross-border administrative transfers. Colvin was a compact, efficient man who had been at this post longer than I had and who had, in my observation, very little patience for anything that prolonged his mornings. He came with a small delegation, 2 clerks, a protocol aide, and a color-bearer, a young conscript who stood at the back and watched everything with the particular stillness of a man trying not to be noticed. Colvin looked at Hayne once, looked at the vehicle lane, and then looked at me. "One man," he said. "Corporal Hayne, Keldrath 1st Regiment," I told him. "Full ceremonial escort." Colvin made a brief sound that was not quite a laugh. He turned back to his delegation, said something to his aide that I did not catch, and then walked to the inspection shed with his documents. What followed was the first hour. The first obstacle was the transit classification. Colvin's aide produced a form, a Valdrenian internal transfer document, and indicated that the handover protocol for a body classified under a particular administrative category required only a receipt signature and a recorded witness, not a ceremonial observance. Hayne listened to this. He did not argue. He reached into the document case he had set on the inspection shed counter, produced a single page, and laid it beside the Valdrenian form. It was a Keldrath Regimental Honors Directive, signed by the colonel of the Keldrath 1st Regiment, which specified that any repatriation conducted under the regiment's authority, regardless of the receiving party's classification, was to be accorded full ceremonial honors at the point of transfer. The aide looked at it. Colvin came back and looked at it. There was a brief consultation, partly in Valdrenian, and then Colvin said that the directive applied to Keldrath side procedure but had no standing on the transfer ground itself, which was Neutral Commission territory. Hayne considered this for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "The transfer ground is where I will conduct the ceremony. I am not asking the Valdrenian mission to participate." Colvin said the schedule permitted a 40-minute window for the transfer, and that the abbreviated protocol would complete inside 15. The full ceremony, he noted, would run longer. Hayne said he had arrived 45 minutes early precisely, because he had anticipated this. There was a silence. Colvin looked at the document again. He looked at Hayne. I think he was gauging something, whether this was theater, whether the guardsman would fold if pressed one more time. He pressed. He said that the soldier whose body was being returned had died in a Valdrenian administrative holding facility due to an illness, that there was no battlefield circumstance to honor, that the family had already been notified and was not present, and that, in his judgment, the full ceremony was a performance for an audience that did not exist. Hayne did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He said, "The audience doesn't determine the ceremony, the obligation does." He picked up his document, folded it back into the case, and walked out onto the transfer ground to prepare. I want you to understand what that ground looked like on that morning. It was overcast, the temperature was just above freezing, and the paving was wet from rain the night before. There was no crowd. There was no regiment. There were Colvin's delegation on one side and me and my log on the other, and the flagpole in the middle with the neutral commission standard going slack in the cold. The setting was, by any ordinary measure, exactly what Colvin had described. No one to perform for, no occasion that looked like an occasion. A strip of wet paving at a border crossing with a handful of indifferent officials and a casket on a trolley. Hayne walked to the center of the ground. He took his position. He came to attention, dressed his rifle, and stood there while the casket was brought forward by Colvin's clerks, who moved with the brisk efficiency of men who handle logistics, not honors. A pace that was practical, not ceremonial, because no one had told them otherwise and no one had given them a time. Hayne let them set it down. He waited until they stepped back. Then he began. I had never seen the full Keldrath 1st Regiment repatriation ceremony before that morning. I had seen abbreviated versions, the summary receipt protocols that most transfers use when the escort is a single officer and the paperwork is the main event. What Hayne performed was not that. It was the full observance, every step of it, conducted alone, without a party to follow his timing, without a drum, without a word spoken aloud. He circled the casket at the prescribed pace, slow, measured, each step placed with a deliberateness that had nothing theatrical about it. It was the opposite of theater. It was the removal of everything that was not essential until only the act itself remained. He halted at each of the 4 positions in sequence: head, right flank, foot, left flank, came to attention, held, and then moved again. At the head, he came to the present and held it for the full count. On a wet strip of paving at a border post in the cold, with no one who wanted to be there. What struck me in those first moments was how unhurried it was. There was no compression to acknowledge the circumstances, no apology built into the timing. The pace was what the ceremony required, and Hayne moved at that pace as though the ground he was on and the audience surrounding him were entirely beside the point, which, I came to understand, was precisely the position he held. The man in the casket had been a soldier of the Keldrath 1st Regiment. That fact did not change with geography, or with a Valdrenian administrative classification, or with the cold or the empty paving or the opinion of dressed Colvin. The obligation was fixed. Everything else was weather. I was writing. I kept writing because I did not know what else to do, and because it seemed important that it be recorded. Colvin stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his face flat. I could not tell you what he was thinking. His aide had stopped moving at some point during the circuit and was simply watching. The 2 clerks stood beside the trolley and watched. The protocol aide was watching. The color bearer at the back, the young conscript, was watching with an expression I cannot easily describe. Not contempt, not boredom, something that had started as those things and had been replaced gradually by something else entirely. He was perhaps 20. He held the Valdrenian mission standard at the carry, which is the neutral position, and he had not moved since Hayne began. The ceremony took, by my log, 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I timed it because Colvin had made timing a point of contention, and I thought it might matter. At the conclusion, Hayne came to the present one final time, rifle up, eyes forward, chin level, The whole of his bearing gathered into a single point of stillness, and he held it for what the Keldrath directive specifies as the closing count. 12 seconds. I counted those too. When it was done, he came to order. He stepped back one pace. He waited. The silence on that ground lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the color bearer at the back of Culvin's delegation, without instruction, without a signal, without anyone looking at him or telling him what to do, stepped forward one pace, came to attention, and brought the Valdrenian mission standard to the salute. It was not a regulation salute. It was not clean. His arm angle was off and his grip shifted partway through. He was a conscript, not a ceremonial guardsman, but it was unmistakably a salute, and he held it for the full count of what Falln had just performed, and then he brought it back down and stepped back into line. Culvin turned and looked at him. He did not speak. The handover paperwork was completed in 6 minutes. I witnessed it. The casket crossed at 9:41. Falln signed the final receipt, collected his document case, and returned to the Keldrath transport without ceremony, because the ceremony was finished, and what remained was logistics, and he understood the difference. I looked up from the counter as the transport pulled onto the approach road. Culvin was still on the transfer ground, hands behind his back, facing the flagpole and the direction the casket had gone. I do not know how long he stood there. I had paperwork to file. I wrote the incident up in full that evening, more than I had written for any single entry in 4 years at Renfeld, more than any abbreviated summary required. I wrote it because the color bearer's salute had not been ordered, and I did not know how to classify it, and because it seemed to me that the kind of act that gets done correctly in front of no one, performed in full, on a cold, wet strip of paving, for an audience of indifferent officials and a logbook, was the kind of act that ought to be on the record. The Keldrath 1st Regiment's directive said the ceremony was owed to the fallen soldier, regardless of who was watching. Falln had taken that at its plain meaning and acted accordingly. He had not argued, not performed, not sought acknowledgement. He had prepared his ground, done his duty, and gone back to his post. The color bearer had watched a man treat an obligation as an obligation, and something in him had recognized it. I have thought about that 11 minutes and 40 seconds many times in the years since, about what it requires of a man to perform a full honors ceremony alone, in front of people who would prefer he didn't, with no crowd to validate it and no superior to commend it, about what it says about a man's understanding of what the ceremony is actually for. There is a version of duty that requires an audience to function, that draws its energy from being seen, commended, recognized. That version collapses the moment the room goes cold, the moment the schedule is made a weapon against it, the moment a Valdrenian liaison officer stands with his hands behind his back and his face flat and his whole bearing communicating that none of this is necessary. I have seen that version of duty fail at this post more than once. Documents unsigned because the right witness wasn't present. Protocols abbreviated because the senior man was running late. The shape of the obligation preserved while its substance was quietly set aside. Falln did not perform that version. What I watched on that transfer ground was a man who had separated the ceremony from every condition that might excuse him from performing it, and then performed it anyway. The cold did not matter. Culvin's impatience did not matter. The absence of a regiment, a crowd, a family, a commendation, none of it mattered. The soldier in the casket had earned the full honors of the Keldrath 1st. That was the whole of it. It is not for the audience. Falln said it himself, quietly, in the inspection shed, before he walked out onto that wet paving and proved it. The obligation determines the ceremony, not the room, not the audience, not the weather or the schedule or the opinion of the man who controls the paperwork. I keep my log because it is a condition of the assignment. That morning, for the first time, I kept it because it mattered.